呢度唔該呢度。好後邊
轉翻過嚟啊！好，啱喺呢度啊！
Welcome to the press conference today. Now the speakers are the following. In the middle, we have Mr. Adolf Leung, the government economist. On the left, we have Ms. Joyce Chung, principal economist. And on the right, we have Ms. Wendy Hong, assistant commissioner for Census and Statistics. Mr. Adolf Leung will give opening remarks in Cantonese and English, and then we will take questions. Mr. Leung, please. Good afternoon. First of all, welcome to the press conference today. Today, I shall report to you the economic situation for the second quarter in Hong Kong, as well as the annual economic forecast. Now, some main points. In the past few months, because of the external negative factors that deteriorated, especially the global inflation surged, and also the enhanced monetary policy tightening by major central banks. As a result, it's greatly weakened the global economic drive. Because of that, the Hong Kong economy, despite the improvement in the second quarter, the extent of improvement was weaker than expected. The real GDP decreased at a moderated pace at 1.3% from a year earlier, after contracting by 3.9% in the preceding quarter. There is a quarter-to-quarter increase of 1%. Because of the worsened external factors, it will continue to pose a risk to our to our exports performance. However, because of the relaxation of quarantine measures for inbound travelers, it will help our recovery. Domestically, given that the epidemic is under control, local economic activities should see better rebounds. However, the tightening of monetary policy would have some effects. Now we have adjusted downwards the real GDP growth forecast for this year to minus 0.5% to 0.5%. Now for the situation in the second quarter, there are two graphs. On the left side, we have the local GDP. The year-on-year decrease has moderated. For the second quarter, the year-on-year decrease is negative 1.3%. There is a quarter-on-quarter rebound of 1.0% in the second quarter. On the right-hand side, these are the components of the GDP. In terms of the external and domestic demand, the performances are different. In terms of external demand, the total exports of goods and services have performed worse. the decrease has widened compared with the one in the first quarter. Domestically, the domestic demand has improved somewhat. In terms of fixed capital formation investments, the decrease has narrowed down to 3%. In terms of private consumption expenditure, there is even a positive growth despite a mild 0.1%. Now, looking more closely to different segments, in terms of the external sector, the global economic situation has worsened sharply. From this graph, you can see that the mainland, the euro area, and the U.S. economies growth. In terms of the U.S., the year-on-year growth has slowed down significantly. Quarter on quarter, in the U.S., for the first 2 quarters, there has been a quarter-on-quarter decrease. In euro area, there is also a slowdown of growth. Now, it may seem not too bad. However, the quarter-on-quarter increase of growth is very mild. The same problem exists in the euro area and the U.S. That is the high level of inflation. Central banks have enhanced a tightening monetary policy and further dampened economic growth. In the mainland, in the second quarter, the magnitude of the slowdown is significant. It has decreased to 0.4%. Compared with the U.S. and Europe, in April, some major cities have seen a rebound of the epidemic situation, thus disrupting production activities, demand, and also logistics and supply. In May and June, because of the easing of the epidemic situation, the economy has bounced back. Due to the unfavorable external factors in the second quarter, Hong Kong's export performance was bad. The year-on-year fall has widened to 8.6%. The performance in different markets. In the mainland, the exports to mainland has dropped significantly in the second quarter. The growth of exports to the U.S. has slowed down significantly, and also the increase of exports to EU and ASEAN countries have been mild, and the performance of exports to other Asian countries has been better.
So aside from the external economic environment, another reason for poor second quarter exports is cross-boundary land transport. On the left diagram, you can see the daily average cross-boundary goods vehicles, and we see in February, March, there was a severe COVID situation. The cross-boundary land transport dropped from 16,000 to 4,000, and we saw some recovery. In June, it was still just some 7,000 odd cars daily, compared to 16,000, 17,000 daily. This is less than half. So that's important for Hong Kong exports. And on the diagram on the right, you can see in the second quarter, our overall exports dropped 2.4% year on year. And if you look at the exports by land, it has dropped by 20%. We're looking at imports in the second quarter. The overall imports had risen by 1.3%. But if you look at imports over land, it has dropped 35%. And why is that important? Because last year, Hong Kong exports, half of it was over land. And 40% of our exports are by land. So the impact is very large. Looking at export of services, in the second quarter, there was a mild growth, 2.3%. And if you look at the different components, Travel sector, the increase was very large, 67.8%, but it's because of a low base. So even with a 67.8% increase, our tourist numbers, our travel services, compared to pre-COVID, it's still very low. And the good performers are the financial services. There's been a growth of 4.4%. If you look at business and other services, it's still dropping. So moving on to the domestic economy, we see the COVID situation has improved, social distancing is relaxed, and the government has provided a lot of support. Personal consumption in the second quarter has recovered lost ground. There's a mild growth of 0.1%. The second quarter labor market improved. That also helped with consumption. But by the end of the quarter, it seemed that the growth momentum had slowed down. There might be a couple of reasons. That is, COVID seemed to have rebound, and our daily infection numbers are going up. And perhaps the U.S. rate hike is starting to affect consumption confidence, and it might also have an impact on the Hong Kong financial sector. So the momentum had slowed in the latter part of the quarter. So moving on to investment, in the second quarter, the business environment was much better than the first quarter. After May, June, the improvement had slowed down or even leveled off. But if you look at the whole second quarter compared to the first quarter, the overall confidence was much better. The confidence improvement led to a drop in the slowdown in investment, and capital expenditure in machinery, equipment. The drop first quarter was 14.5%, and it slowed down to 2.1% in the second quarter. The labor market in the second quarter had improved. Now we see that after seasonally adjusted figures, the figure was 5.4% in the first quarter, and it dropped off. So overall, it was 4.7%. So we see the employment figures, the trend is quite stable. In the first quarter, it moved up to the peak in February, April, and then it's tapered off. And by the end of the second quarter, it was 3.0%. So the different level of the level of unemployment in different technical workers have also unemployment has been being reduced. So the next diagram illustrates the different levels of unemployment in different sectors. Now we see retail, food and beverage. The drop in the second quarter was quite significant. It dropped to 8.6% in the first quarter. Actually, 7.4% in the first quarter. So food and beverage, the drop was very obvious. It dropped to 8.6%. So aside from retail, hotel services, accommodation services, other obvious drops, such as construction, arts, entertainment, these areas that need more of a human touch also saw a drop. On the inflation side, in the second quarter or the first half of the year, our CPI or inflation was mild. If you look at the different components, we see fast rising items are in fuel, but fuel, the weighting of fuel is very small. It's only about 3% in our CPI. So even if fuel prices go up quickly, it doesn't have a large impact on overall prices. So food price increase, these include basic staples, In February, March, because of COVID, land transport hiccups, and that led to impact on supply. So in the first quarter, food prices went up very quickly. In the second quarter, we see a drop from the peak, but it's still much higher than last year. So basic food staples, prices are going up very quickly. Social distancing is being relaxed, and we have more human activities. Restaurants are doing better business. So dining out, the prices are going up. So the other major components are rising mildly. So the overall CPI is still mild. In the property market, because COVID is coming under control, in April, the property market saw some recovery, but subsequently, the market came to a standstill. U.S. rates spiked, and the global economy weakened. So in May, June, we saw a slowdown in the property market. So there was a mild price increase in the property market in April, but that was wiped out in May, June. So overall, property market prices didn't change too much. So if you look at the transactions, compared to the low base level in the first quarter, we rose almost 50%. We had some 15,000 transactions, but that is not a high level. It's still a rather mild level. And recently, after the second quarter, it seems that the second-hand market is quiet. Prices are flat. The first-hand property market, we see some developers pricing very aggressively. They're pricing it at a discount. And in the second quarter, the affordability index is still at a high level at 71. So that indicates that property prices, even it's slightly down from the beginning of the year, but it's still at a high level. It's still out of reach for most of the market.
Now on to the outlook for the rest of the year. Internationally, the energy prices remain elevated. There are still disruptions to the supply chain. So the transportation costs, despite having climbed down from the peak, is still much higher than the pre-pandemic level. So for advanced economies, inflation will remain high. So the graphs show the inflation forecast for the US and the Eurozone. Now in July, the inflation rate has climbed down from 6.1%, 8.9% to 8.5%, which is still a high level. So in July, the inflation rate was 8.9%. Now the private analysis forecast an inflation for the US of 8% for the year and 7.5% for the euro area, which are very high levels. So because of that, the Europe and US central banks are actively tightening the monetary policies. So in the US, 255 base points have been increased, and there have been 4 interest hikes already. So according to a forecast, there will be 100 more data point hike. Now, the European Central Bank has increased the interest rates by 0.5% and expected to increase another 1% within the year. Because of interest hikes at different places, it will affect the economic forecast. So this graph shows the IMF global economic forecast in July. The forecast was 3.2%. Down 0.4% comparing with the previous forecast. So the figures in the middle are all in red. It shows that the IMF's forecast for almost all economies have been revised downwards. the downward adjustments concerning the U.S. and the Eurozone are the greatest. Locally, if we can keep the pandemic under control, there will probably be further recovery of economic activities in terms of private consumption and investment. The extent depends on the financial situation concerning the impact on real economic activities. On inflation, there are still external price pressure. The inflation level of our import source countries are still high. However, the inflation pressure locally is mild. In terms of rent, the increase is mild. There are even some decreases. So the inflation pressure locally is still mild. So this slide summarizes our forecast for the rest of the year. Externally, overall speaking, the visibly worsening external situation will seriously affect our export performance. Now, in the second half of the year, the mainland's economy may further rebound. The performance was bad in February. There were some recovery in March and April. However, it doesn't entirely offset the further worsening of Western economies. Now, if there is visible improvement in terms of the cross-boundary land transports between the two places, there will be further rebound. And also the latest relaxation of quarantine arrangements for inbound travelers will help the recovery as well. Now, locally, domestic economic activities should revive further, provided that the epidemic situation remains under control. The consumption voucher scheme will also continue to support consumption demand. On the other hand, tighter financial conditions may dampen consumer sentiment and spending. And also, rising borrowing costs may also make businesses more cautious in undertaking fixed asset investment. Now, because of the despite the price pressures, domestic inflation should remain moderate. So we have revised downward our economic forecast for the year from 1 to 2% in May to minus 0.5% to 0.5%. In terms of underlying inflation, the forecast is still 2%. Now I will recap what I've said in English.
I will now briefly summarize the key points in English. The Hong Kong economy improved in overall terms in the second quarter, but the extent of improvement was weaker than expected. Real GDP decreased at a moderate pace of 1.3% from a year earlier, after contracting by 3.9% in the preceding quarter. Weakened global demand and continued cross-boundary transportation disruptions dragged heavily on exports. Meanwhile, domestic activity saw some revival, but the momentum softened in the latter part of the quarter. Compared to the first quarter of this year, real GDP increased by 1.0% after seasonal adjustment. Goods exports fell by a widened 8.6% in real terms in the second quarter. Exports to the mainland fell visibly further, and those to the US and EU showed moderated growth, while exports to most other major markets in Asia continued to increase. Services exports increased mildly by 2.3%, among which exports of travel services surged, but were still very subdued, and cross-boundary financial activities recovered somewhat. Domestic demand showed some improvement. Private consumption expenditure regained lost ground with marginal growth of 0.1% in real terms from a year earlier. As the local epidemic situation improved, social distancing measures were relaxed, and the government rolled out various support measures. Overall investment expenditure saw a narrowed decline of 3.0% as business sentiment improved. The labor markets improved, after rising from 5.0% in the first quarter to 5.4% in February to April, the seasonally adjusted unemployment rate fell successively to 4.7% in the second quarter. The unemployment rates of most major sectors decreased from high levels in February to April, particularly in the food and beverage service activities, retail, construction, and arts, entertainment, and recreation sectors. Underlying consumer price inflation edged up to 1.7% in the second quarter, but remained moderate overall. Prices of meals out and takeaway food showed an accelerated increase, and prices of energy-related items soared, while those of basic food and clothing and footwear continued to see visible increases. Nonetheless, price pressures on other major components stayed broadly in check. I will now turn to our latest economic forecast. The markedly deteriorating external environment will weigh heavily on Hong Kong's exports in the remainder of the year. Elevated inflation and aggressive monetary policy tightening in the advanced economies will further weaken the global growth momentum, though the expected revival of the mainland economy should provide some offset. Risk factors, including the evolving pandemic and heightened geopolitical tensions, warrant close attention. Nonetheless, if cross-boundary logistics disruptions show more visible easing, Hong Kong's external trade may get some relief. The latest adjustments to the quarantine and testing arrangements for inbound visitors should also help exports of services. Domestically, economic activities should revive further, provided that the local epidemic situation remains under control. The consumption voucher scheme will continue to support consumer demand, but tighter financial conditions may have some dampening effect on consumer sentiment and spending. Rising borrowing costs may also make businesses more cautious in undertaking fixed asset investments. Taking into account the worse than expected economic performance in the first half and the sharp deterioration of global economic prospects, the real GDP growth forecast for 2022 is revised down to negative 0.5% to 0.5%, from 1 to 2% as announced in the May round of review. On inflation, external price pressures are expected to remain notable in view of elevated inflation in some major input sources. Yet, overall inflation should remain moderate in the near term as domestic cost pressures stay mild. The forecast rate of underlying consumer price inflation for 2022 is maintained at 2%. We're now happy to take questions.
Please identify your media outlet before you raise questions. RTHK, I'd like my first question to be, after relaxing the quarantine arrangements to 3+4, what kind of stimulus will that have on the economy? Can you quantify the quarantine policy? And you mentioned that consumption, service exports, investment and trade are weak, and the market is now concerned about external weakness. So investment and trade, will that be dragging down our performance? Is that the reason why we are in negative territory? And onto the property market, a lot of people expect that when the US rates increase, the prime interest rate will have to go up. So for the second half of the year, do you expect Hong Kong interest rates to follow the US? So even though Hong Kong interest rates don't follow US rates closely, but the US rate hike was rather unexpected, and would that have a large impact on the property market? So will that lead to negative property values? So let me tackle the questions one by one. So the relaxing of quarantine measures, So that is very important in rebuilding Hong Kong's connection to the rest of the world. But we have to consider the actual COVID situation. So I think there should be benefits, and they would be on two areas. That is, the number of Hong Kong inbound tourists would go up, so that would help the economy. On the other hand, when it's more convenient for people to work or do business in Hong Kong, or when Hong Kong people travel overseas for work and business, that would be hard to quantify into our GDP figures. So this relaxation, how many tourists can we attract? It's hard for us to forecast, but I can give you some figures. We calculated that if 1 million tourists come to Hong Kong, that would contribute 0.1% to our GDP. And investment, trade, are they lagging behind? Yes, especially external trade. That would be a poor performer for the whole year because the external environment is not that good. The investment sector, we have interest rate hikes. Hong Kong liquidity is tightening. The cost of lending is going up. So that will have an impact. So aside from cost of borrowing, we also have to look at the business prospects. Just now we mentioned if the COVID comes under control, our local economic activity improves, then when business prospects improve, more people will be willing to invest. And if the cost of lending goes up, that will suppress the overall performance. The same for consumption. We see that when COVID comes under control, the labor market improves, and with the stimulus of the consumption voucher, the second half of the year it should be supported by these measures. But overall, we still have interest rates going up and bleak economic prospects. That would affect consumption confidence. So the growth rate might not be as significant as expected, but we feel that consumption should have a slow recovery. Now, moving on to the property market, the rate increase will have an impact on property market. First of all, a direct impact would be on the mortgage payments. Those will go up. So we looked at the figures, and if the mortgage interest rate goes up by 1%, then every month the payments will go up some 14%. And it also has an impact on asset prices. Well, but at the very least, up till today, in the first half of the year, the property market has been soft, and overall speaking, it has been adjusting in a stable manner, and prices have dropped 3%. So that is not a shocking or alarming rate. Well, but there is still an impact. So when you invest, you'll have to be cautious and balance the risk carefully. Next question. Commercial radio. Yesterday, it was announced that 110,000 people left Hong Kong. That's the peak since the handover. So from the half of 2020, we have seen 250,000 people leave Hong Kong. What impact does that have on GDP? Will that suppress GDP, especially on investment and personal consumption? Well, the net outflow of people should not have a large impact on GDP. Currently, the problems Hong Kong is facing are the poor global economic outlook. We have COVID suppressing demand. and previously our manufacturing and a lot of things were affected by COVID. A lot of activities cannot continue. So the pressing needs we have right now are demand and whether we can resume our economic activity. So the population issue is not a big factor right now, but in the long term, how much can the economy grow? Of course, that is related to the population. So we believe we need to attract talent. We need to increase the labor supply. We are totally aware of that, and we are working on it. Yesterday, the CE said that we need to recruit more high caliber talent. We need to provide, you need to increase the supply of talent. The government is looking at increasing the labor participation rate, especially for females or the elderly. Can more people join the labor market? And we will also maintain Hong Kong's attractiveness to attract more overseas talent to come work in Hong Kong. So we're working on that, and it's a long-term issue. Next question. You mentioned that trade and investment would suffer. So does that mean in Q3 the figures will worsen? You said you adjusted the GDP figures. Have you considered the mainland travel ban? So do you see a growth in the GDP figures, or where will the growth come from? Well, if you look at the impetus for growth, externally it's weak. So exports, we feel the prospects are not that good. Domestically, there will be a recovery. Just now we talked about consumption. The labor market is improving. We have the stimulus from consumption voucher. The COVID is under control. So consumption should be the engine of growth. On investment, the environment isn't all that bad. Compared to exports, the investment is doing better. I mentioned that it depends on business prospects. If locally our economic activity can recover and business prospects improve, there will be an investment need. It's just that when the cost of borrowing increases, that might suppress the demand for investment.
We estimate that the yearly GDP growth would be a minus 0.5% to 0.5%. So actually, last year it was minus 2.5%. So you can expect more growth in the second half of the year. The gentleman in black. Good afternoon. I'm from Hong Kong Economic Times. I'm Kevin. Now about the annual growth forecast. The range is minus 0.5% to 0.5%. Have you taken into account the relaxed 3+4 arrangement? Well, if not, with the relaxed arrangement, what will be the impact on the GDP forecast? So before the end of the year, there may be further relaxation, even 0+7. So with that in mind, will we have a positive GDP growth for the year? Now the minus 0.5% to 0.5% GDP growth has taken into account the possible relaxation. Relaxation of quarantine measures would definitely have an impact, but the extent of which is not completely clear at this moment. So the forecast is in a range that is between minus 0.5% to positive 0.5%. If the impact, if the measures are very effective, then it would be towards the upper limits of the range. If the effect is less than expected, then it may be closer to the lower limit of the range. The lady with long hair.
At Nikkei. I've got two questions. The first one is about what's your outlook on the China's economy. Do you think it can achieve the target of 5.5% growth? And how would that impact on the Hong Kong's economy? And second, is Hong Kong right now is in a technical recession? Thank you.
On the first question about the mainland economy, in the second quarter, the mainland economic growth decelerated sharply to 0.4%, largely due to the relapse of the pandemic in some of the major cities. And so looking forward, and the pandemic is now basically under control, and the mainland authorities have rolled out a number of measures to support the economy in terms of increasing the fiscal expenditure, in terms of providing more support, more monetary support to different industries, especially the SMEs. And also they have relaxed some of the measures on the property market. So we expect the mainland economy will continue to revive in the second half of the year. And this should help provide some offset to the deteriorating global economy and should be one factor supporting Hong Kong's exports. But of course, we expect that it may not be able to totally offset the impact of the deteriorating global economy. And on the question of technical recession, and yes, we recorded 2 quarters of year-on-year contraction. But if you look at the quarter-to-quarter change, in fact, we recorded a expansion in the second quarter. So in fact, the economy is improving, and we are also expecting that economic growth in the second quarter will accelerate. So I don't really think this is a recession scenario.
Next question, please. The lady in deep blue. Good afternoon, I'm from Now TV. Now about the reduction in the second quarter. Now it was 1.4. Now it is adjusted downward to 1.3%. So what is the reason for the adjustment? Second question, the annual growth rate. You said you have taken into consideration the relaxation of the quarantine measures to 3+4, but you have still adjusted the forecast downward. So what is the major obstacle towards Hong Kong's economic growth? Now from -1.4% to -1.3%, I would invite Ms. Wendy Hong from the Census and Statistics Department to take the question. Now we have considered more data points to come up with the figure. Now for private consumption and also export and import of services, there have been some changes. Sorry, can you repeat the second question? Sorry, the speaker is not using the mic. Now on the annual economic growth, that is from -0.5 to +0.5%. You said you have taken into consideration the 3+4 arrangement. Compared with May, the forecast has been revised downwards. We foresee that there would be an economic growth brought about by the relaxation measures, but why is there still a downward adjustment? What is the major obstacle? Now from May until now, we have observed significant deterioration of the unfavorable global economic factors. First, in advanced economies, the inflation level remained high. So the central banks have stepped up tightening monetary policies. That would dampen global economic growth and cause a direct impact on our exports. In terms of financial market, it has tightened it's worsened the global financial markets. There are interest rate hikes overseas and in Hong Kong. That would affect confidence and also investment and consumption sentiment. So we have to adjust the forecast downward. The next question, please. The lady in green. Good afternoon, I'm from Cable News. Now, we have seen 2 consecutive quarters of contraction. What about the third quarter? Can we resume positive growth? Now, the second batch of consumption vouchers have been issued. However, according to the retailers, the help is not great. So has the public exhausted their consumption power? Well, for the second half of the year, we forecast a positive growth. So the combined growth would be a minus 0.5 to positive 0.5% for the year. Now, you said the consumption voucher did not result in an economic growth or consumption growth. Well, we have to look at the statistics. In August, in terms of retail sales, the figures would be reflected in September or even October. By then, the situation would be clearer. Now, we do see some impact already. Now, in terms of eating out or shopping, and recently there have been 2 major exhibitions, the Anycom exhibition and the Gourmet exhibition. According to the industries and the public, it seems that the consumption sentiment is good. And also the labor market has improved. We expect a further improvement. This will surely help consumption as well. So local economic activities, especially consumption-related activities, will continue to revive, barring a rebound of the epidemic or any unforeseeable circumstances. Next question, please. The gentleman with glasses. Still on the consumption situation. Later on, there may be interest rate hikes imposed by banks. Mortgage payments burden may increase. Will that offset the boosting effect brought about by the consumption voucher scheme? And concerning the contribution of a consumption voucher scheme to our GDP, what is the percentage? Has it been offset because of the increased mortgage payments and the interest rate hikes? Now, the inflation level overseas is significant. So what about the risk of imported inflation? Would the risk be higher?
We also see that in the second quarter, figures are negative. Does that mean that the impact of consumption voucher has not taken effect? Well, I think local economic activity, especially consumption, it can continue to recover. There are a few reasons for that. The consumption voucher is one factor. The labor market has improved. Third, there's an assumption that COVID has to come under control. So I think these factors lead us to believe consumption will recover. Now, you're saying that interest rates are going up. Will that have an impact? Will that offset the growth? Yes. At least we think even if you take that offset into account, we still believe that there will be a recovery in consumption. You talked about imported inflation. Now, overseas inflation is high. We see there is imported inflation pressure. The mainland has high inflation, but with the Hong Kong dollar, US dollar being on the strong side, to a certain extent that can offset that mainland inflation. Now, we have mild inflation in Hong Kong. Rent, business rent, commercial rent, the increase is mild, and sometimes it's even falling. Even for residential rent, it's very mild right now. Salaries, we're seeing a mild salary increase. So the overall price pressure is very mild. So added together, inflation should not be too high. So I think Hong Kong inflation is not the biggest worry facing Hong Kong. When do you think we can recover to the pre-COVID levels of 3.9%? Well, between May and July, I don't have those figures yet. I think it will be available next week. Our forecast is it should continue to fall. So we feel that there should be further room for improvement, but how quick can it recover or improve? There are different factors affecting that. First of all, second half of the year, local economic activity, how good will the recovery be? Now, if it's as expected that the recovery will continue into the Q3 and Q4, then the labor market should continue to improve. So how much more will unemployment fall? It will also depend on labor supply. In the last couple of years, some people have left the labor market. So when the market improves, they will join the labor market. So we'll have to see how many people return to the labor market. Overall speaking, we feel the labor market will continue to improve. The extent will depend on different factors. Do we have any other questions? Last question, lady in white. TVB, just now there was a question about property prices. When interest rates go up, you talked about negative equity. How large will that impact be? Do you have a rough estimate? And I also want to ask about the consumption voucher. We're now in phase 2 of the consumption voucher. Do you expect what the stimulus will be in the third and fourth quarter? And the last question is about commodity prices. Do you think prices will continue to go up? Your question on property prices, the interest rate will have pressure on property values. Will that lead to negative equity? Well, in the last 10 plus years, the government had a lot of supply management policies. They have a lot of macro management policies. The market is healthy, much healthier now. If you look at the mortgage figures, it's less than 50-60%. And when you borrow money from the banks also have safety checks. They look at your mortgage payment ability. They look at and it's capped at 50% of income. In the second quarter, the new mortgage figures were some 30-odd%. So first of all, the mortgage percentage or the mortgage ratio is lower than before. People's financial health is better. So even property prices come down a little bit, we don't feel that it would have a serious impact on the stability of the market. We don't feel it will affect financial stability. No. The impact of consumption voucher on growth. When the budget was announced, everybody would receive $10,000 in the form of a consumption voucher, and our estimate was that the GDP growth would benefit 1.2%. your question on inflation. In the first half of the year, inflation was 1.6%. Now we forecast for the whole year it will be 2%. So we feel in the second half of the year, inflation will speed up a little bit, but it should not be too severe. So overall speaking, inflation in Hong Kong is not a large problem at this stage. Okay, that concludes today's press conference. Thank you.